They said the land was gone, that my family's ranch, the one I had spent every blistering summer repairing fences on, the one my father had bled on when a bull gored him, the one my mother had prayed over before dawn milking sessions, wasn't mine anymore. And when I first heard those words over a scratchy call in a desert tent halfway across the world, my blood ran colder than the Afghan nights, because it wasn't just dirt and barbed wire they had taken. It was history, legacy, and the only home my little girl had known. And the way my buddy Ramirez looked at me after overhearing that call, eyebrows raised like he couldn't believe such betrayal was even possible. I knew this wasn't just a mistake or a bureaucratic screw-up. This was the kind of treachery that came wrapped in false smiles and filed paperwork, the kind that carried HOA letterheads and signatures from people too smug in their neighborhood meetings to think a soldier would ever come back to claim what was his. Because in their minds, once you were overseas, sweating under Kevlar and ducking mortars, you stopped being a real neighbor and turned into just a name on an absentee mailbox. A nuisance they could erase with a vote, and maybe they thought selling my land would be clean, that I would never know until it was too late. But what they didn't realize was that the Army doesn't just train you to fight enemies abroad. It teaches you patience, strategy, and the art of waiting for the exact moment to strike. And as I listened to the crackle of static mixing with the words, "Your ranch has been sold to the HOA and parceled into 22 luxury homes," I clenched my fists so tight the veins in my forearms looked like ropes, and I whispered to myself, "Then let them build their palaces on stolen soil, because when I return, I won't come alone." And that vow became the drumbeat that carried me through each patrol, each firefight, each weary sunrise when my boots were soaked in dust and sweat. Because while my comrades dreamed of cold beer and hot showers back home, my dreams were of reclaiming cedar fence posts, of pulling down HOA signs, of seeing their manicured cul-de-sacs collapse under the weight of truth. And the more I learned, the darker the betrayal grew. How the HOA president, a woman named Deborah Klein with pearl necklaces and an obsession for power, had called an emergency meeting the month after my deployment, whispering lies about unpaid dues, code violations, and an abandoned property status, twisting the law until it bent enough for a crooked judge to sign off on the sale. And my neighbors, men and women who had shared cookouts with me, who had patted my shoulder when I deployed, voted unanimously to approve the takeover, probably telling themselves it was for community development. And I wondered if any of them paused before raising their hands. If any of them thought about the soldier sweating in a tent who still paid his mortgage every month through auto debit, who still had a wife and daughter watering the oak trees on weekends. But no, the HOA wanted power, and power meant swallowing land, and my ranch was the fattest meal they could devour. Yet as I dug deeper, calling home whenever I could, piecing together the story through my wife's trembling voice, I realized they hadn't just taken the land. They had demolished my barns, bulldozed my father's cattle pens, paved over the well where my grandfather once pulled water with blistered hands, and in their place, they built sprawling mansions with 3-car garages, swimming pools shimmering under stolen sunsets, driveways where imported cars gleamed like trophies, and each one sat atop memories they had erased. And the thought of strangers sipping wine where my mother once hung laundry filled me with a rage so sharp it was almost blinding. But rage without direction is just fire that burns itself out. And I wasn't about to let this flame die, because if there's one thing war teaches you, it's that patience sharpens anger into a weapon. So I planned, I calculated, and I promised myself that when my boots finally touched home soil again, I wouldn't come back with just stories and scars. I would come back with an army, and the HOA had no idea what was marching toward them, because while they sat sipping lattes in board meetings, they forgot something essential. A soldier never fights alone, and the brothers I had bled with in sand and fire would stand beside me on my home turf just as fiercely as they did overseas. And the first time the idea truly crystallized was under a blood-red sunset after a brutal patrol, when Ramirez lit a cigarette and muttered, "Man, if somebody tried that with my mama's house, I'd call the whole damn platoon." And everyone chuckled, but I didn't laugh. I just looked up from cleaning my rifle and said, "What if I do?" And the silence that followed was heavy, curious, almost reverent. because we all knew what that meant, and in that moment, the plan stopped being fantasy and became mission. Because the HOA thought they had stolen from one man, but what they had really done was awaken an entire company of trained warriors who owed their lives to each other. And when men like that decide to fight, there isn't a gated community or smug boardroom in America that can stop them. So as the desert winds howled outside our camp that night, I whispered to myself that Deborah Klein and her cronies had just declared a war they weren't prepared to fight, and the clock had already started ticking down to the day the army would come home. I didn't sleep that night, and in truth I hardly slept for the rest of that deployment, because every time I closed my eyes I saw my ranch not as it had been, but as it was now, paved over, desecrated, claimed by people who thought money and influence were the same as honor and sacrifice, and the images burned hotter than any desert sun. So instead of chasing rest, I chased information, piecing together what happened like a battlefield puzzle. And with each call home, the picture sharpened. Deborah Klein had convinced the HOA board that my property had become a blight while I was overseas, citing phantom code violations like unsafe fencing and non-compliant structures, even though my wife kept every bill paid, every tax current, and every acre maintained with help from my brothers-in-law. But when my wife stood before the HOA to defend our rights, Deborah silenced her with smug smirks and lawyer jargon, telling her she had no standing without me present, and when my wife argued louder, they called security to escort her out like she was some trespasser, and that humiliation broke something in her. Something that I could still hear in her voice months later when she whispered, "I tried. I really tried." But they laughed at me, and I wanted nothing more in that moment than to be there, to wrap her in my arms and remind her she wasn't alone. But distance is a cruel jailer, and all I could do was keep promising, "Hold on, I'll fix this when I come home." But promises are cold comfort when bulldozers tear down barns. And the night she called crying that they had cut down the century-old oak where our daughter carved her initials, I punched the steel wall of the barracks until my knuckles bled, and Ramirez had to pull me back before I broke my hand, muttering, "Save it, brother. Save it for the ones who deserve it." And that became my mantra. Because in war you learn to ration not just water and ammo, but fury itself, to bottle it up until it can be unleashed with precision, and every humiliation, every betrayal they inflicted on my family was fuel for the fire I was building. And the others saw it too. Soldiers who barely knew me began asking about my land, my family, and when I told them about Deborah's empire of cul-de-sacs and HOA fines, they shook their heads, muttering things like, "Man, civilians don't even know what real battles are," and "sounds like she's begging for a fight she can't win." And slowly, without me even asking, they began volunteering ideas. A buddy who studied law before enlisting said he could pull records when we got back. Another whose cousin was a county surveyor promised he could dig up deeds and plats, and Ramirez, always the loudest, declared he'd camp on my ranch with a dozen rifles before letting one more mansion rise. And though we laughed, deep down none of us thought he was joking, because we were soldiers, and soldiers don't joke about loyalty. So as the missions dragged on and the months bled together, my personal war plan was being written in the dirt and smoke of the Middle East. And with every firefight I survived, with every explosion I walked away from, I felt the inevitability of my return growing stronger. Like fate itself was pushing me back toward that stolen land, because the army had made me many things: hard, relentless, disciplined, but most of all, it made me unbreakable. And Deborah Klein had no idea she was building her dream neighborhood atop a fault line ready to split wide open the moment I returned. And the timing could not have been sharper, because just as our tour was ending and word came down we'd be shipped stateside within weeks. My wife sent me photos of the ranch as it now stood, 22 McMansions lined in a row like smug sentinels. Identical driveways, manicured lawns, children riding bikes where cattle once grazed, and in the middle of it all, the Klein Estates sign, polished marble with gilded letters, like a gravestone marking the death of everything my family had built. And I stared at those pictures until my vision blurred, until Ramirez snatched the phone from my hand and cursed, "They don't even hide it, do they? They flaunt it like a damn trophy." And I swore right then, with my whole squad as witnesses, that the moment I stepped off the transport plane, I wasn't going home just as a man. I was going home as a storm, and Deborah Klein would learn what it meant when the Army brought its war back to American soil. And maybe it sounds dramatic to anyone who hasn't served, anyone who hasn't felt that brotherhood, but I knew deep down that this wasn't just about one ranch anymore. It was about principle, about the arrogance of people who thought soldiers were expendable tools to be forgotten the moment they were gone. And reclaiming my land became symbolic for all of us, a kind of justice every man in my unit wanted to see delivered. So we made a pact under desert stars. When we returned, the HOA would face not just one soldier, but a battalion of fury. And as I looked at the faces of men who had carried me bleeding through firefights, men who would take bullets without hesitation, I realized Deborah Klein hadn't stolen my ranch. She had declared war against an army. When the plane finally touched down on U.S. soil, the roar of its engines felt like the drumbeat of destiny, and as the hatch opened, I could smell the wet earth of home even before I stepped off. But the home I was returning to wasn't the same one I had left, and that truth sank deeper with every mile closer to my county. And though most of the guys went their separate ways, promising to reunite when I called, Ramirez and 2 others stayed by my side, insisting they wouldn't leave me until I stood on my ranch again, because they knew this wasn't closure, until I saw with my own eyes what Klein Estates had become. And the drive there was the longest of my life, every familiar road now lined with signs for luxury homes available and community of the year. And each one felt like a spit in the face, like the county itself had conspired in the theft, but nothing compared to the moment I turned onto what used to be my dirt driveway, the one I had graded myself with a tractor borrowed from my uncle. And instead of ruts and oak shadows, I was greeted by a row of brick pillars and a wrought iron gate with the words "Clean Estates" arched across the top, and a keypad where a lock used to hang, and I swear I could feel my father's ghost raging beside me. Because this wasn't just theft, it was desecration, and before I even spoke, Ramirez muttered, "That gate won't keep us out for long." But I told him no, not yet, because this wasn't about breaking in, it was about reclaiming. And to reclaim, I needed more than anger. I needed evidence, allies, and precision. So I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and drove us back into town, where my wife and daughter were waiting, and that reunion nearly broke me, because my little girl clung to me like she would never let go, whispering, "They took our swing tree, Daddy," and her words cut deeper than any bullet ever had, because no child should have to grieve for a tree. And my wife's eyes told me everything: fear, exhaustion, shame for not being able to stop it, but also hope now that I was back. And that hope was the anchor I needed. So after the hugs and tears, I pulled out a notepad and began the real mission briefing, one every bit as detailed as the ones we'd drafted overseas, because this war would be fought not just with fists, but with records, laws, and strategy. And step 1 was gathering proof. So over the next few days, I visited the county clerk's office, pulled deeds, mortgages, HOA filings, and I found the rot ran deep. The judge who had signed off on the foreclosure had been Deborah Klein's college roommate. The attorney representing the HOA had 3 pending ethics complaints, and the vote to seize my property had been pushed through during a special session held at Deborah's own mansion, with notices mailed only to the HOA board itself, excluding every other resident, a blatant violation of open meeting laws, and with every document I uncovered, my case grew stronger. But paperwork alone wasn't enough, because Deborah Klein wasn't just a rule bender. She was a queen in her little empire, feared and obeyed, and the neighbors who had once been friendly now avoided my wife in grocery aisles, too scared of fines or retaliation to even say hello, and that cowardice infuriated me. But it also reminded me that people like Deborah rule through fear, and the best way to break fear is to show strength. And strength is something I had in spades. Not just my own, but the strength of men trained to stand shoulder to shoulder through hell itself. So when Ramirez gathered with us one night at my in-laws' barn, and I laid out the stolen deeds, the crooked minutes, and the forged signatures. I told him and the others. This isn't just about my land anymore. This is about proving no soldier's sacrifice can ever be exploited like this again. And the look in their eyes told me they were ready. Not just ready, but eager, because they were tired of watching the powerful stomp on the powerless. And we all knew Deborah Klein had grown too arrogant, too sure the system was hers to command. But she had forgotten the one thing every general knows. Arrogance blinds you to the enemy building in your shadow. And we were that enemy, patient, methodical, relentless, and now we were home. A woman, likely in her 40s, with blonde curly hair, wearing a white blouse, a red vest, a tan skirt, and red heels, stands on the left side of the frame, aggressively gesturing and shouting at a female soldier. The soldier, in her 20s, fair-skinned and wearing a military uniform, stands opposite the woman, holding papers and appearing calm. Beside the soldier is a German shepherd dog sitting attentively. Behind them, 2 more soldiers in uniform stand at attention. The setting appears to be a rural farm or ranch, with a wooden fence, a pasture with cows, a military vehicle, and a barn in the background. A windmill and wind turbine are visible in the distance under a bright blue sky with scattered clouds. The woman is pointing her index finger aggressively, her face showing a furious expression. The lighting is bright, suggesting a sunny day. The composition emphasizes the confrontation, with the woman's aggressive posture contrasting the soldier's composed stance. The breaking point came the night Deborah Klein tried to intimidate me directly. Pulling up in her imported SUV outside my in-laws' place where we were staying, headlights glaring like searchlights, and she stepped out in heels that sank into the gravel, clutching her clipboard like it was a weapon. And with that patronizing tone she reserved for people she thought beneath her, she said, "You need to let this go, Sergeant. The community has moved forward, and no one wants to see a war hero embarrass himself fighting something already settled." But I didn't move, didn't blink. I just stood with my arms crossed, Ramirez flanking me like a stone wall, and I told her quietly, "I don't embarrass myself. I bury people who cross my family." And the flicker in her eyes told me she believed it, even if she'd never admit it. And when she tried to rattle off legal jargon, I cut her off with, "Every document you signed is under review. Every vote you took is under scrutiny, and every lie you told is about to be dragged into daylight." And though she tried to laugh it off, I could see her confidence wavering because she thrived in shadows. In whispered meetings and paper trails, no one questioned. But sunlight burns parasites, and she knew the sun was rising. And the proof came 2 weeks later when the local news ran a story. Deployed soldiers' ranch seized by HOA, complete with photos of my daughter crying where the oak tree used to stand. And the outrage that followed was like wildfire. Veterans groups, civil rights lawyers, even politicians scrambling to condemn the theft. And suddenly Deborah Klein was no longer the untouchable queen of her HOA kingdom. She was the face of greed, plastered across screens as the woman who stole from a soldier at war. And though she tried to spin it, hiring PR firms and staging charity events, the tide was turning because my fight had become everyone's fight. And when I walked into the courthouse with Ramirez and half a dozen veterans behind me, the judge didn't see just one man, he saw a movement. And though the legal battle would stretch on, though appeals and counter motions clogged the system like weeds, I knew the momentum was ours because for the first time since I landed back home, Deborah Klein was on defense, scrambling to protect what she thought was hers. And I realized that Section 1 of this war was complete. The ground was shaken, the enemy exposed. And though the mansions still stood on my soil, their foundations were trembling because it wasn't just about land anymore. It was about principle, about honor, about proving that no amount of money, no board meeting, no crooked alliance could erase what was built on sweat, blood, and sacrifice. And as I looked out at Klein Estates under a setting sun, rows of polished driveways and manicured hedges, I didn't see defeat. I saw a battlefield primed for reclamation. And I swore to my wife, my daughter, and the brothers who stood with me that every brick laid on my land would be ripped back, every nail pulled, every mansion undone. Because this wasn't over, this was just the opening salvo, and the army was only beginning to march. The moment the news broke wide and the headlines spread, Deborah Klein shifted from smug tyrant to cornered animal, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she lashed out harder, because people like her never surrender quietly. They double down on lies and sharpen their claws. And true to form, within a week, a stack of fresh lawsuits landed on my doorstep, each one alleging ridiculous things: defamation, trespassing, interference with community development, and even emotional distress for daring to show up at HOA meetings. And my wife nearly collapsed under the weight of the legal fees until a team of pro bono veteran lawyers reached out. Men and women who had heard my story and refused to let one of their own be drowned in paperwork. And suddenly, Deborah's weapons of intimidation were being parried stroke for stroke by attorneys who knew every trick in the book. But Klein wasn't finished. Not by a long shot, because the very next week, someone slashed the tires on my truck. Someone spray-painted traitor across my in-law's barn. And though the sheriff shrugged, calling it kids messing around, I knew better, and so did Ramirez, who stayed awake on the porch with a rifle across his lap, muttering, "Let them come back. We'll see who's the traitor." And I realized Deborah was trying to paint me as the villain now. The soldier who had come home angry, unstable, dangerous, hoping the community would turn against me. But the opposite happened, because the more she tried to smear me, the more people started questioning why she was so desperate, why she was pouring so much energy into silencing a man whose only crime was serving his country. And whispers began spreading, not just in Klein Estates, but in town. Whispers of kickbacks, of secret developer deals, of donations to politicians that looked a lot like bribes. And when I dug into campaign finance records with the help of a buddy who had once been Army intel, the web grew thicker. Deborah had been funneling HOA funds into shell companies tied to her cousin's construction firm, the same firm that had built every mansion on my land. And suddenly I wasn't just fighting to reclaim my ranch. I was holding the key to exposing a network of corruption that reached far beyond a single neighborhood. And I knew if I pushed hard enough, this wouldn't just topple Deborah, it could topple county officials, developers, maybe even a judge or two, and that realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Because the higher the stakes, the more dangerous the enemy became. And late one night, as I sat in the barn going over documents, my wife walked in pale and trembling, handing me an envelope slipped under the door. And inside was a single-typed page that read, "Soldier boys die overseas all the time. Don't make the mistake of dying at home." And though my blood turned to ice, I forced myself to smile for her, to tell her it was just another scare tactic. But inside, I felt the weight of what we were really up against. And when I showed it to Ramirez, he just loaded another magazine and said, "Good. Now they're scared." But I knew this was more than fear. This was desperation, and desperate people are dangerous. And Deborah Klein was backed into a corner with too much to lose, which made her the most dangerous of all. The threats didn't slow me down. If anything, they lit a fire inside me. The same kind of cold fire I'd felt overseas when the enemy thought they could scare us into backing off. And I knew that the only way through was forward. So I doubled down on gathering evidence, piecing together receipts, contracts, bank statements that showed HOA dues being siphoned into accounts with no legitimate purpose. But every time I uncovered one dirty lead, another one popped up, like cutting off the head of a hydra only to see two more grow. And I began to wonder just how deep this corruption ran. And that was when Ramirez made a chilling discovery: an old land deed, shoved in a forgotten filing cabinet in the county records office, that not only confirmed the ranch had been in my family since the 1800s, but also revealed that Deborah's so-called developer rights had been forged. A fake signature, a notarization from a clerk who had been dead 5 years before the paperwork was allegedly filed. And suddenly the entire foundation of Klein Estates was rotten to the core. But here's the twist. As we prepared to present this at the county board meeting, the file vanished. The entire cabinet had been accidentally cleared out in a convenient fire, the clerk blaming faulty wiring. And though everyone in town whispered that Deborah had arranged it, nobody could prove it. And I realized I was no longer just dealing with her. I was dealing with a machine that protected her. A machine that didn't care if it had to break laws to keep her empire standing. But if they thought destroying paper would stop me, they didn't understand what soldiers do. We adapt. We improvise, we document everything twice, 3 times. And Ramirez had already scanned the deed into multiple hard drives and encrypted backups. And when Deborah stood at that board meeting smiling, insisting the deed never existed, I stepped forward, plugged in a projector, and the room went dead silent as her forgery appeared 10 feet high on the wall, with the death certificate of the notary right beside it, and gasps spread through the audience as people who had once defended her began to realize they had been conned. And Klein's face flushed red, her smile cracking like cheap glass. But even then, she didn't back down. She screamed about doctored evidence, about smear campaigns, about outsiders trying to destroy a peaceful community. And though the board voted to investigate, I could see in their eyes they were scared, not of me, but of her, or rather of whoever was backing her, because I was starting to suspect Klein was just the front, the face of a bigger beast. And that suspicion was confirmed the next day when a black SUV with tinted windows rolled up to my driveway, 3 men in suits stepping out, not developers, not cops, but the kind of men who moved like they'd been military once too. And they introduced themselves with fake smiles as consultants for community safety, warning me that I was disrupting the stability of the region and hinting that if I didn't stop, my family's safety couldn't be guaranteed. And that's when it clicked. This wasn't just about property or money. This was organized, systemic, maybe even cartel-connected, and my little war over a ranch had just escalated into something that smelled like federal crime, maybe even international laundering, and while most men might have pulled back in fear, I felt that same stubborn steel in my veins that had carried me through firefights in villages halfway across the world, and I knew that if I quit now, Deborah wouldn't just win. She'd bury me, and worse, she'd bury every family who had trusted her. So I looked those men in the eye and said, "Tell your boss I'm not going anywhere." And as they drove off, Ramirez muttered, "Congratulations, brother. You just declared war." The SUV encounter marked the line of no return, and from that moment, every step forward felt like marching into enemy territory. But soldiers don't hesitate once the line is crossed. So I spent the next weeks transforming my fight into something bigger, because what had started as a battle to reclaim my ranch had now turned into a crusade to expose the rot that had infected the entire county, and maybe beyond. And if Deborah Klein thought she could intimidate me with men in suits and empty threats, she didn't account for the fact that every time she turned up the heat, I turned up the pressure twice as hard, and my Army brothers rallied like it was a deployment all over again. One of them ran digital forensics and tracked Deborah's shell accounts back to a Cayman Island company linked to a Texas developer with ties to a senator. Another buddy dug through public records to uncover a list of politicians who had received suspicious campaign donations tied to HOA funds. And before long, we had a dossier thicker than a field manual, a ticking bomb of evidence that could take down not just Klein, but everyone connected to her. But the closer we got, the more the attacks escalated, because suddenly my wife's car was run off the road one night by a black pickup with plates traced back to nothing, and my kids were followed home from school by strangers who melted away when confronted. And that was the night Ramirez came into my living room and said what we were all thinking. "This isn't an HOA war anymore. This is cartel level and they don't care about rules." And he was right, because I had felt this kind of invisible pressure before. The weight of an enemy that operated in shadows, one that didn't play by laws or morals. But instead of breaking me, it sharpened me, because I knew exactly how to fight an enemy like this, expose them, drag them into the light, force them to play on open ground, and to do that, I needed the biggest spotlight I could find, so I went public. Standing on the courthouse steps with cameras rolling, holding up the forged deed, the death certificate, the bank transfers, my voice steady as I declared that Deborah Klein and her allies had stolen my ranch while I served overseas, laundered money through fake developments, bribed officials, and threatened my family. And I swore to fight until every house built on my land was returned, and the video went viral within hours. Veterans across the country sharing it, journalists calling me, people flooding my inbox with support but also with warnings. Because some of them had tried to expose similar schemes in other states and had been silenced, forced to disappear, and though I read every message, I knew there was no turning back because Deborah wasn't just a corrupt HOA president anymore. She was the face of a machine that had to be dismantled. And when the FBI finally called asking for a meeting, I knew the fire I had lit was spreading faster than she could contain it. But Deborah wasn't going down quietly. At the very next HOA meeting, she stood before her neighbors, her voice shaking with fury as she spun a story about me being a violent veteran with PTSD, claiming I was a danger to the community, that I was fabricating documents to smear an innocent woman, and to my disgust, some people bought it, nodding along, whispering about my temper, about how I stared too hard, how I carried myself like I was always ready to fight. And though I wanted to scream at them, I forced myself to stay calm, because I knew anger would only prove her point. But then came the real twist. A week later, as Deborah held her little rally in the community clubhouse, the feds swooped in, agents in windbreakers pushing past stunned homeowners, seizing boxes of files, dragging out computers, and slapping cuffs on Deborah herself. And for one brief, glorious moment, I thought it was over, that justice had been served, that my land would finally be mine again, but I was wrong. Because as Deborah was shoved into the back of a federal car, she locked eyes with me and smiled, not a smile of defeat, but a smile of someone who knew she wasn't beaten. And the very next day, news broke that she had made a deal, that she had flipped on her partners, and though she was facing decades in prison, she was trading information for protection, and the names she dropped were explosive: county commissioners, state senators, even the banker who had financed the HOA's expansion. But not once did she mention the true shadow power. The men in suits from the SUV, the ones I knew were pulling the strings, and I realized that Klein was just a pawn, a loud, arrogant pawn who had been sacrificed to save the real players. And my war wasn't close to over, it had only shifted gears, because now it wasn't Deborah on the attack, it was the people above her, the ones who had resources, reach, and a lot more to lose. And that became clear when 2 nights later, Ramirez and I came back from a meeting with federal agents to find my barn engulfed in flames, the roof collapsing as livestock screamed, my grandfather's tractor reduced to ash. And though the fire department called it an accident, I knew better, we all did, because that was the playbook: intimidate, destroy history, erase roots. But if they thought fire could erase me, they forgot that soldiers are built to rebuild from rubble, and as I stood in the smoke, watching generations of my family's work collapse into cinders, I swore out loud, "You'll regret this." And Ramirez put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Then let's make them regret it together." And that night we gathered in my living room, every army buddy I'd called, every neighbor who'd turned against Klein after the arrests. And we formed a plan that wasn't about survival anymore. It was about reclamation, about taking back every square inch of what had been stolen. And we moved like a unit, documenting, networking, feeding evidence to journalists, showing up at council meetings, filing lawsuits not just against Deborah but against her allies. And while the shadow men moved quietly, we moved loudly, forcing their names into the papers, dragging their deeds into the light. And every time one tried to duck away, another journalist or veteran group would corner them, until slowly the machine began to falter, cracks spreading across its armor, but it wasn't without cost. Because one night Ramirez's truck was run off a bridge, and though he crawled out alive with a broken arm, it sent a clear message that they were willing to kill us now. And I knew that if I wasn't careful, my family could be next. So I made the hardest decision of my life. I sent my wife and kids to stay with her parents 2 states away, telling them it was just until things calmed down. Though in my gut I knew things wouldn't calm down until this war ended. And as I kissed my kids goodbye, their small hands clutching my uniform sleeve, I promised them I'd win no matter what it took. And as their car drove away, a cold steel resolve settled in me, the same resolve I'd felt before stepping into firefights overseas. Because now the battlefield wasn't some desert village, it was my own hometown, my own ranch, and I wasn't just fighting for land anymore. I was fighting for every soldier who had ever come home to find vultures waiting. And I was fighting for my family's future. And though the machine was vast, it had one fatal flaw: its arrogance, its belief that nobody could touch it. And arrogance, I knew, was the seed of downfall, and I intended to water it until it choked them. Because this wasn't just my fight anymore. This was a mission, and missions are completed. One way or another.